Imagine crossing an ocean in a wooden shoebox, sharing your toilet with 30 strangers, surviving on moldy hardtack, and arriving at a frigid, empty coast where the welcome package is frostbite, dysentery, and a deeply personal relationship with starvation. Oh, and you have blisters, lots of them. Welcome to Pilgrim life. Romanticized in textbooks, sanitized in elementary plays, and worshipped by novelty cornucopias. But in reality, being a 17th century pilgrim wasn't holy. It was horrible, and blistered feet were just the start. Let's peel back the wool stockings of history, and hope you brought ointment. If this sounds like your kind of misery, tap that subscribe button. It won't cure scurvy, but it might soothe your curiosity. Also hydrate. You're already doing better than they did. Let's get one thing out of the way right now. The pilgrims did not wear buckle hats. There, we said it. No silver clasps. No shiny forehead decoration. No inexplicable fashion statements that made them look like extras from a Thanksgiving-themed car commercial. That image, the one plastered across school bulletin boards and awkward holiday centerpieces, is pure colonial fan fiction, and like most historical myths, it's about as accurate as using an Instagram filter on a Civil War photograph. Now that we've ripped off the decorative lace collar, let's meet the real pilgrims, the ones who didn't smile serenely while harvesting golden cornfields with their best friend Squanto, the ones who didn't sit at a table brimming with pumpkin pie and mutual understanding, the ones who, fun fact, actually thought dancing was a sin, bathing was a slippery slope to vanity, and theatre was a gateway drug to eternal damnation. The pilgrims were not whimsical hat wearers on a gratitude quest. They were religious separatists and Puritans, which, historically speaking, is code for less fun than a damp sock. So why did they flee England? Here's the sanitized version you got in 3rd grade. They were persecuted for their beliefs. Or, so noble, so tragic, so oversimplified. The actual story? They left because England wasn't Puritan enough. That's right. They looked at King James and the Church of England, which, let's be honest, was already no rave, and said, "This is too wild for us." Their solution: leave behind the sinful chaos of tea, poetry, and human emotion, and start over in a place with fewer distractions, like a frozen, barely mapped coastline. But first, they made a quick detour to the Netherlands. Why? Because the Dutch, unlike the Inglicks, had this radical little idea called religious tolerance. It was like Airbnb for Protestants. Not perfect, but at least the walls weren't on fire. The pilgrims stayed in Leiden for over a decade, working humble jobs, wearing tragic amounts of grey, and watching their children become too Dutch. Yes, that was an actual concern. Their kids were learning to ride bikes, eat cheese, and heaven forbid loosen up. Horrified, the pilgrims decided it was time to leave the liberal tulip fields and take their chances in the New World. Because if there's one thing more terrifying than being persecuted, it's watching your child enjoy life. Enter William Bradford, the group's designated overachiever and future chronicler. If the pilgrims had a group chat, Bradford ran it. He journaled everything: deaths, births, crop failures, and probably what he had for breakfast. He wrote of Plymouth Plantation, which is the colonial equivalent of live tweeting your trauma. And then there's Miles Standish, the colony's not-so-gentle military advisor. Imagine giving a sword to a man with a Napoleon complex and a shaky understanding of diplomacy. That's Standish. He was 5'0", quick to anger, and occasionally solved disputes by stabbing people, a natural leader. So, to recap, the pilgrims were a small, highly strung group of religious hardliners who left the Netherlands not because they were being chased out, but because they feared cultural contamination. They dreamed of a pure society free from vice, laughter, and people who wore colours other than beige. But wait, it gets better. They weren't even that united. The passengers aboard the Mayflower included 2 main groups: the saints, the devout separatists, and the strangers. Everyone else, including hired help, adventurers, and some poor soul who probably just wanted a new job. They tolerated each other about as well as you'd expect a vegan monk and a frat boy to get along in a 1-bedroom apartment during a pandemic. And still, despite the ideological divide, the lice, and the fact that half the group had no idea how to survive in the wild, they pushed forward. Why? Because they believed they were chosen, that God had selected them to endure unbearable suffering and frozen cornfields in order to build a righteous society that would shine like a holy city on a hill. Except, no one mentioned the hill would be covered in snow, starvation, and rotting fish. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just imagine this. You're in 1620, boarding a cramped, splintery ship with your extended family, a few barrels of salted meat, and an overwhelming sense of moral superiority. You're wearing 10 layers of wool, because laundry is considered indulgent, and your feet already hurt from all the wooden flooring. There are rumors of native peoples, wild animals, and maybe even gold. But mostly you're hoping to build a society where no one plays cards, laughs too loud, or thinks dancing is acceptable behavior. And your hat? Your hat is not buckled. It's probably shapeless, soggy, and smells like wet goat. Let that image sink in. These weren't symbols of liberty. They weren't early American superheroes. They were just humans, tired, rigid, full of fear and faith, and really bad footwear. They weren't setting out to found a nation. They were just running from one culture and stumbling into another. So the next time you see a cheerful plastic pilgrim at your local grocery store holding a turkey platter and smiling like they've just been blessed with enlightenment and stuffing, remember, the real ones didn't even know what stuffing was. They were starving, scared, and spiritually constipated. No buckles, no pie, just a ship full of blistered hope and people who found joy suspicious. There are bad vacations, the kind where your Airbnb has no hot water, the local cuisine turns on you like a Shakespearean villain, and your cousin loses the passports. And then there's the Mayflower, the trip so uniquely awful, so perfectly engineered for discomfort and despair, that even Dante would have needed a new circle of hell just to fit it in. Let's set the scene. September 1620. The Mayflower is docked and ready to go. By ready, we mean leaking, overcrowded, and recently repaired with questionable carpentry. A glorious 100-foot-long wooden crate held together by prayer, tar, and the blind optimism of people who thought they could find divine destiny in an unfamiliar wilderness. Classic. Crammed inside this floating coffin, 102 passengers plus crew, livestock, salted meat, and what we'll generously call medical supplies, which mostly amounted to brandy and questionable herbs. There were pregnant women, there were toddlers, there were men with swords and zero nautical experience. And there was one communal chamber pot. One. Now, in case you haven't personally lived in a cramped wooden hull for 66 consecutive days without plumbing, here's the highlight reel. Everyone vomits, constantly. The waves pitch hard enough to launch you across the hold like a rag doll. The smell. Imagine a mix between wet dog, fermented cabbage, and human despair, and then multiply it by 100 bodies. Zero airflow, and the kind of hygiene practices that make medieval barbers look like surgeons. The first few days at sea, morale was high, psalms were sung, dreams were dreamed, and then came the storms. Oh, the storms. These weren't just little gusts that rattled your timbers. We're talking full-blown, ship-cracking, wave-flipping tempests that snapped the main beam of the Mayflower like a twig. At one point, the vessel came within inches of turning into driftwood. The only thing that saved them, a great iron screw, likely a printing press jack, which they used to push the broken beam back into place. If you're wondering whether using a glorified book clamp to hold your ceiling together during a hurricane is a good idea, it's not. But desperate people become very creative under pressure, especially when they're also vomiting. And then there's the food situation. You don't exactly get a continental breakfast on the high seas in 1620. No croissants, no eggs Benedict, just hardtack. The term hardtack is generous. These were bricks of flour and water, baked until even termites gave up. Stored in barrels, they quickly became home to weevils, which the pilgrims ate anyway because, let's face it, protein. Water, of course, turned foul after a few days. They switched to beer, which sounds more fun than it was. Picture warm, slightly vinegary, bacteria-safe barley water sloshing around in wooden casks. Hydration with a side of headache. Also on board, livestock. Chickens clucking miserably in the hold. Possibly a goat. And definitely several children with no shoes, no concept of personal space, and infinite energy. Somewhere in the chaos was a man named Elias, probably not his real name, but go with it, who snored like a thunderclap, and insisted on singing hymns in his sleep. Everyone slept in shifts. Privacy didn't exist. There were no baths. People relieved themselves in buckets that were tossed overboard with such frequency that you began to understand why swimming near the Mayflower wasn't ideal. Did I mention disease? because that's the cherry on top of this soggy nightmare Sunday. Seasickness was just the opening act. Dysentery, scurvy, and mysterious fevers soon joined the party. Coughs turned into hacking fits. Skin infections spread faster than rumors, and yet, somehow, people still managed to argue over theology. Imagine nearly dying of starvation only to be lectured by a man named Obadiah about your questionable interpretation of the book of Leviticus. A true vacation highlight. Still, through all this, the stench, the cold, the moaning, the casual brush with death, the pilgrims clung to their belief that they were on a holy journey. Every cracked barrel and rotting turnip was part of God's test. Suffering wasn't just expected, it was encouraged. You weren't just seasick, you were sanctified. Of course, not everyone shared this enthusiasm. Some passengers, the so-called strangers, were just hoping for new land or a paycheck. They didn't sign up for a floating monastery. Tensions simmered. Arguments broke out. Factions quietly formed between the holy rollers and the practical folk who just wanted a clean cup and a nap without stepping in something. And yet, somehow, no one jumped overboard. Maybe they were too hopeful. Maybe they were too weak. Or maybe they looked at the roiling sea, the dark sky, and the endless cold, and realized that, statistically, staying on the death trap was still better than becoming fish food. 66 days. That's how long the voyage took. Over 2 months of splintered floors, bad theology, and communal despair. By the end, they were barely holding it together. Clothes were damp, eyes were hollow, and every joint ached like it was auditioning for a Shakespearean tragedy. Then, finally, land. A grey, wind-swept coast that looked less like a promised land, and more like a very large disappointment. But we're not there yet, because just as they sighted shore, one final little plot twist arrived. They had landed in the wrong place. So, there they stood, blistered, broken, malnourished, and of course, not exactly a hallmark ending. But hey, they survived the Mayflower. Barely. Let's be honest, if you've spent 66 days clinging to life inside a mouldy wooden barrel, anywhere that isn't the Atlantic Ocean looks like paradise. So when the Mayflower's passengers spotted land on November 9th, 1620, they were thrilled, hopeful, possibly hallucinating. The coastline was rugged, the sky slate grey, and the trees looked like they might actually be capable of murder. But it was land. It didn't rock. It didn't stink yet. And best of all, it didn't have rats, at least not the two-legged kind. Only, there was one little issue. It was the wrong land. You see, the Pilgrims weren't actually supposed to land in what we now call Massachusetts. Their patent, basically their permission slip from the Crown, allowed them to settle in the northern parts of the Virginia colony. Somewhere near the Hudson River, not Cape Cod. Definitely not snow-covered forest where your face freezes off before breakfast territory. They had drifted hundreds of miles north, and worse, there was no going back. Returning south wasn't an option. The Mayflower was in rough shape, low on supplies, and every man aboard had the physical endurance of a boiled carrot. They had to make do. So they dropped anchor near the oddly hook-shaped landmass known as Cape Cod, and began the next phase of the pilgrimage, aimless wandering and intense bickering. If the Mayflower voyage was bad, what came next was essentially a colonial scavenger hunt, but with more dysentery and fewer prizes. The men began going ashore in small groups to explore, looking for a decent place to settle. What they found were thorny woods, freezing streams, and a persistent lack of shelter, food, or comfort. Also arrows, occasionally. The local terrain was wild, unfamiliar, and extremely unwelcoming. The trees were too dense to navigate. The wind howled like it had personal beef with humanity. And the snow. Oh, the snow. It wasn't just cold. It was malicious. It got into your boots, your blankets, your everything. If weather could file a restraining order, this storm would have done it preemptively. And then came the mishaps. One group of men, bravely foolishly exploring in the freezing cold, forgot where they parked the boat. Lost in the woods, they stumbled around for hours in soaked stockings and brittle boots, shooting at rustling bushes and probably arguing about whose fault it was. Another scouting party ran into abandoned native dwellings and promptly helped themselves to corn caches they found buried underground, a decision that would come back to haunt them like an angry ghost made of maize. As the days dragged on, more issues emerged. Infighting grew worse. The saints were frustrated by the strangers. The strangers were sick of sermons. William Bradford, ever the diary king, noted that morale was tanking fast. And let's not forget, this wasn't even winter yet. That was still warming up in the bullpen. After nearly a month of poking around and debating, they finally settled on a location, a spot near a former Wampanoag village that had recently and tragically been wiped out by plague. The area was cleared, had fresh water, and didn't immediately try to kill them. That was the standard. Won't kill us immediately became prime real estate criteria. They named the place Plymouth. Not because it had any actual connection to their situation, but because that's where they left from in England. If you think that sounds like the naming equivalent of I guess we'll just call it Steve, you're not wrong. Now here's where things get even more ironic. They decided on Plymouth, not because it was promising, but because they were exhausted, cold, malnourished, on the verge of giving up. And it was there. They were out of options, and honestly out of willpower. They landed not with a trumpet of destiny, but a whimper of, "This'll do." Let that sink in for a moment. One of the most mythologized settlements in American history was founded out of sheer apathy, not inspiration, not divine signs, just bone-deep, frostbitten fatigue. And of course, they hadn't actually built anything yet. The settlement at this stage consisted of trees that needed chopping, land that needed clearing, and a handful of rickety shelters that could barely keep out a stiff breeze, let alone a New England nor'easter. And as it turns out, chopping trees in sub-zero temperatures while wearing damp wool and open blisters, not ideal. But even amid all this, the group still found time for paperwork. That's right, the famed Mayflower Compact was written during this limbo period. Signed by 41 men, it was the colonists' attempt at civil self-governance, or at least a temporary truce before somebody got smacked with a musket. In truth, the compact was less about liberty and more about preventing mutiny. With the ship off course, the patent invalid, and tensions rising, they needed everyone to agree on basic survival rules. In other words, let's not kill each other before the weather does. It worked. Barely. But now, the Pilgrims had a location, a loose agreement, and just enough hope to start digging in, literally and metaphorically. Still, they knew very little about the place they had landed. The soil wasn't exactly fertile. The climate made England look tropical, and although the area seemed empty, it most certainly wasn't. Indigenous peoples had lived here for centuries. The only reason it appeared vacant was because disease, likely brought by earlier European traders, had decimated local communities. But the Pilgrims didn't know that. Or they didn't ask, or they didn't want to. All they saw was opportunity. A second chance, and a whole lot of trees that needed chopping. So there they stood, soaked, shivering, slightly paranoid, and started building a colony they hoped would be righteous. Never mind that they were in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong supplies. They had faith. They had axes. And, unfortunately, they had blisters. There's a saying in real estate: location, location, location. And if you're a pilgrim in 1620, standing in the frozen wind with nothing but a wool tunic and religious trauma to keep you warm, any patch of earth that doesn't actively try to murder you feels like prime property. So when the settlers finally stumbled upon a spot with cleared fields, freshwater streams, and a slightly less terrifying tree line, they called it a blessing, or, as William Bradford put it, a special providence of God. Now, that's one interpretation. The other interpretation, the less quoted one, is that the land was cleared because everyone who had lived there was, well, dead.
Welcome to Patuxent!
Before the Pilgrims arrived and renamed it Plymouth, this village had been home to the Wampanoag people. It was a thriving, coastal community with cultivated fields, intricate knowledge of the land, and a history stretching back generations. That is, until European ships, helpful as ever, brought diseases like smallpox, leptospirosis, or possibly viral hepatitis. The exact plague is debated. The impact is not. Over just a few years, from around 1616 to 1619, the population of Patuxent and neighbouring communities was decimated. In some cases, mortality reached 90%. That's not an outbreak. That's an apocalypse. So when the Mayflower's passengers arrived in December 1620, they weren't walking into untouched wilderness. They were walking through a graveyard. and not a symbolic one, an actual one. The fields they so eagerly praised had been cultivated by dead hands. The houses they reclaimed were abandoned by families who never lived to return. The tools and stores of corn they dug up, funeral leftovers, unearthed like treasure from beneath snow and sorrow. And the Pilgrims, to their credit, noticed this. But rather than pausing for a moment of reflection or moral conflict, they chalked it up to divine favor. To them, the epidemic that had cleared Patuxet was not a tragedy, it was a heavenly bulldozer. Bradford even referred to it as God clearing the land to make way for his chosen people. Chosen, apparently, to farm atop the bones of the recently deceased. Let that sink in. This was not an empty land waiting to be filled. It was a space emptied by unimaginable loss. And the newcomers, whether out of ignorance or necessity, began hammering their future into the soil before the blood had fully dried. Of course, survival mode doesn't leave much room for sentiment. The Pilgrims had just spent months at sea, inhaling other people's breath, and surviving off beetle-infested bread. They were starving, they were sick, and they were desperate for shelter. The abandoned Wampanoag dwellings, known as Wetawash, were quickly repurposed. They scavenged tools, ransacked storehouses, and helped themselves to bury caches of corn, bean seeds, and other supplies left behind by the dead or displaced. To them, it was providence. To history, it's pillaging. But moral ambiguity aside, the eerie stillness of Patuxet left its mark. The wind howled through empty structures, children played beside unmarked graves. The settlers, most of whom had never seen a Native American in person, built fires with beams stripped from homes that had once sheltered mothers, fathers, elders, and infants. Even Miles Standish, the colony's famously aggressive military man, reportedly moved with caution during those early days. It wasn't just the physical emptiness, it was the feeling, the weight of death in the air. The land was too quiet, the silence too thick. They didn't know what had happened here, but they knew it wasn't natural. That didn't stop them, of course. Foundations were laid, one-room houses went up. A communal storehouse was built to hold the rapidly dwindling food supply, and as winter rolled in like a vengeful ghost, the settlement took shape, awkward, creaky, and full of contradictions. While some settlers built homes, others buried bodies. Because yes, people were already dying. It didn't take long, the cold was brutal, and half the colony still lived on the ship, battling illness, exposure, and whatever foul spirits lingered in the ship's bowels. The so-called first winter would soon earn its own paragraph in every history book, a brutal season where hunger gnawed at their bones. Diseases spread like gossip, and more than half of them would die before spring. But even as mortality mounted, construction continued. And underneath it all was a kind of cognitive dissonance. The belief that this was still holy work, that suffering was sacred, that building a future atop tragedy wasn't just acceptable, it was ordained. They didn't question why the fields were already tilled. They didn't ask why no one came to greet them. They didn't wonder who had lived there first. Instead, they gave thanks and kept digging. And that, right there, is one of the more uncomfortable truths of the American origin story. The foundation wasn't just built on rock and timber. It was built on absence, on bones, on the hollowed-out remnants of a people wiped out by diseases they never saw coming. This doesn't make the Pilgrims evil, but it doesn't make them innocent either. They were products of their time, deeply religious, deeply hungry, and deeply oblivious to the cost of their survival. They weren't villains, but they weren't the heroes the textbooks promised either. They were just people, freezing frightened, and standing knee-deep in somebody else's history. So the next time you see a reenactment of cheerful settlers planting symbolic corn seeds in freshly turned soil, ask yourself, who planted there before? Who walked those same fields barefoot? Who whispered prayers that went unheard? Because history isn't just written by the survivors, it's written on the backs of the forgotten. Let's talk about feet. Yes, feet. Those poor, swollen, frost-bitten, God-fearing appendages that carried the Pilgrims through the most pious misery ever put to leather. If you've ever complained about breaking in a new pair of boots, just know that in 1621, a comfortable shoe was one that didn't give you trench rot before sundown. Now, the average Pilgrim shoe, often called a latchet, was a hard leather contraption about as forgiving as a Calvinist sermon. Picture stiff cowhide, shaped with questionable skill, laced up with a cord that either snapped in the rain or turned into a frozen noodle by mid-January. There was no cushioning, no arch support, no concept of orthopedic health. It was foot armor, if the armor doubled as a medieval cheese grater. And yet, they walked, miles and miles, through brambles, snow, frozen marshes and the occasional field of disappointment. They didn't walk for leisure. They walked to haul timber, fetch water, chase turkeys they had no idea how to cook, and flee from various things they didn't fully understand. Every errand was a hike, every prayer meeting, a pilgrimage, and through it all, their feet suffered silently, or not so silently, depending on the swelling. Let's pause here to appreciate a specific colonial horror, blisters. Those fleshy bubbles of agony weren't just a side effect of hard work, they were daily companions. By week 2 in Plymouth, every man, woman and child had feet that looked like abstract art, red, cracked and quietly weeping. Why not take a break, you ask? Rest the feet? Elevate them beside the fire? Sure, if you wanted to freeze to death or starve. There was no rest in a colony where every hour of daylight meant life or death. Wood had to be chopped, fires had to be fed, shelter had to be built, one splinter at a time. Even the act of going to relieve yourself required a 10-minute trudge through frost and thorns. And in a cruel twist of irony, the colder it got, the less you could feel your feet, until they stopped working altogether. You want to know how blisters were treated? They were. There were no antibiotics, no gauze, no Epsom salt soak at the end of a long day. The cure was wrapping your foot in more wool, preferably the scratchy flea-infested kind, and praying it didn't turn black and fall off. For extra spiritual healing, you might smear on a salve made from goose fat and dried herbs, assuming the goose hadn't already been eaten in desperation. If infection set in, your choices were do nothing and hope for a miracle, or have a fellow colonist with the dexterity of a raccoon lance it with a hot needle. This was not an ideal wellness retreat. Now imagine being a child in this environment. Small feet, bad shoes, daily chores that included fetching firewood, helping butcher animals, and walking to the shore to collect whatever half-frozen sea life hadn't escaped. If your foot got injured, which it did, there were no sick days. You limped, you winced, you endured, because everyone else was doing the same. Even William Bradford, ever the overachiever, once mentioned in his writings how physical toil was making colonists weak and feeble. That's a nice way of saying their bodies were slowly giving up, from exhaustion, from malnutrition, and yes, from the endless parade of untreated blisters. And here's the deeper, more ironic truth. Pain was spiritual. To the Pilgrims, suffering wasn't just tolerated, it was holy. Every cracked heel, every torn ligament, every infected toe was a sign that you were walking the righteous path. Literally, to hurt was to be chosen, to blister was to believe. They didn't just build with their hands, they bled with their feet. It's one of those unsettling theological gymnastics routines, where discomfort is equated with moral purity. In Puritan culture, ease was suspicious, joy was indulgent, comfort was for the damned. The more you suffered, the closer you were to salvation. And this extended beyond blisters. Calluses were sacred. Chafing, a reminder of original sin. Limping, that was your soul dragging your body toward heaven. It's no wonder they weren't exactly known for throwing parties. But let's zoom in further. Imagine, if you will, one particularly foul morning in January. You've woken up on the hard-packed floor of a barely insulated hut. Your blanket is damp, your toes are stiff. You slip on your frozen shoes, grit your teeth, and step outside. Instantly, pain shoots up your legs. That blister from yesterday? It's split. The one from last week? It's become a second blister. Bigger, meaner, somehow sentient. You walk anyway, because the firewood won't carry itself. And if it doesn't get chopped today, your children might not survive the night. Now breathe that in. Frost and all. There's something sobering about thinking of these people not as statues or sermon topics, but as flesh and bone. They were cold, they were hurting, and most of them were just trying to survive long enough to see one green shoot push through the snow. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and take a moment to thank your shoes. Seriously, look down at them right now. Do they hurt? No. Do they reek of goose fat and regret? Probably not. Congratulations, you're already living better than a 17th century colonist. So the next time you get a blister from walking too far in the wrong sandals, take a deep breath, channel your inner pilgrim, and whisper, "At least I'm not lancing this with a fishbone." Because somewhere in the pages of forgotten history, someone did. There's a particular stillness that creeps into a settlement when death becomes routine. Not the loud, dramatic kind with wailing and fainting and orchestral flair. No, this was the quiet kind. The kind where people stop asking, "How are you?" because they already know. The kind where the silence between footsteps says more than any sermon. Welcome to Plymouth, winter. It began slowly. A cough here, a fever there, people writing off chills as just cold air or God's refining fire. But then the coughing didn't stop. The chills became shivering, and the shivering turned into bone-deep weakness. And soon, someone didn't wake up. By mid-December, it was clear the settlement was unraveling from the inside. There were no doctors, no medical plans. Just a shared belief that if you died, it was probably part of God's mysterious and increasingly bleak plan. And so, one by one, people began to vanish from morning headcounts. Let's take a moment to put some numbers to this nightmare. Out of the 102 passengers who had disembarked from the Mayflower, only about half would survive that first winter. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's a coin flip with a body count. At the height of the sickness, only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to care for everyone else. That meant fetching water, preparing food, and burying the dead. Over and over, all while trying not to catch whatever was turning their neighbors into ghosts. Imagine waking up before dawn, your breath freezing in the air, and seeing a shape in the corner of the hut. Still, cold, no longer breathing. You whisper a prayer, not out of habit, but because it's all you can offer. Then you wrap the body, carry it out, bury it quickly. No time for a proper service. No time for grief. You move on, because someone else is coughing. And no one talks about it. Not really. There were no daily bulletins, no obituaries, just the shared understanding that the colony was shrinking. Quietly, steadily, relentlessly. The only time they tried to hide it was from the native tribes nearby. The Pilgrims feared being perceived as weak, and for good reason. With so few men able to fight or defend, the settlement could have been overrun. So when they buried the dead, they did it at night. Under cover of darkness, bodies were placed in unmarked graves, and the soil was carefully flattened so as not to show disturbance. They even planted corn over the burial sites, hoping nature would help disguise the horror. It's hard to imagine what that kind of emotional suppression does to a person, to a child, to a parent. This wasn't just physical collapse. It was spiritual erosion. The very faith that had brought them here, the belief that they were chosen, that their suffering was noble, began to crack. After all, how many funerals can you conduct before the prayers start to feel hollow? William Bradford, ever the chronicler, kept writing. His pages are filled with understatement, restraint, and the haunting weight of a man trying not to fall apart. He mentions death in brief lines. So died, in this season, William Mullins. So died his wife. So died their son, as if naming them without emotion would somehow make the pain manageable. One entry simply reads, "And thus they died, sometimes 2 or 3 a day." Let that settle for a moment. 2 or 3 people? Every single... And yet, the colony didn't fall apart. There's something morbidly inspiring about that. Even as the snow piled higher, and the woodpile shrank lower, and the dead outnumbered the living, someone still got up each morning and lit a fire. Someone still cooked, still prayed, still believed, if only barely. Among the losses were entire families. Fathers left without sons, mothers lost babies, children became orphans overnight. And still, work continued, because survival wasn't optional. If they stopped, if they grieved too long, if they gave in, the entire settlement would collapse. So they buried their people with frozen hands, eyes red from wind, and something deeper, and then they picked up a hammer and kept building. There were no grief counselors, no support groups, only faith, often brittle, often questioned in each other. Of course, not everyone bore it well. Some went mad, others withdrew entirely. Whispers circulated about a woman who wandered into the woods and never returned, a man who refused to eat until he collapsed beside the fire, These stories didn't make it into the official records, but they hung in the air, thick as smoke. And through it all, the wind howled. Not the cinematic kind, the real kind. Biting, constant, sharp as guilt. It rattled the crude planks of the shelters. It pressed against the flimsy windows. And at night, when the fires burned low, it slipped into blankets and settled onto chests like a final, cold hand. But somehow, they made it to spring. Just barely. The sun returned, the snow melted, the graves were overgrown, and new life, cautious, uncertain, began to take root. Why did they stay? Why not board the Mayflower and sail back to England with what little strength they had? Because they couldn't. The ship wasn't returning until spring, and by then, so many had died, that leaving felt like betrayal, like erasing the cost, like admitting it was all for nothing. So they stayed. Not because they were strong, but because there was no alternative. It wasn't courage, it was inertia, covered in frostbite. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes their story human. Because sometimes survival doesn't look like triumph. Sometimes, it just looks like getting up again, even when no one else does. After a winter so bleak it could have been directed by Ingmar Bergman, the Pilgrims were still alive. Barely. Their faces were pale, their faith bruised, their population halved. The graves outside Plymouth now outnumbered the standing homes, and the air smelled like damp timber and spiritual crisis. And then, one fine March morning in 1621, something happened that felt so surreal you could almost mistake it for satire. A man walked into Plymouth and said, "Welcome," in English. Let that hang there. Here you are, expecting a final descent into isolation and death, and suddenly a stranger appears from the woods, wearing nothing but a breechcloth, and the calm of someone who's seen things, and speaks your language better than some of your own colonists. His name was Somerset. He was an Abenaki Sagamore, a tribal leader from what's now coastal Maine. He had learned English through interactions with English fishermen and traders along the coast. And while that alone is impressive, it's what he represented that truly shook the frozen dust off these settlers. Somerset wasn't here to conquer, convert, or confiscate. He was here to talk, to connect, to open a door the Pilgrims didn't even know existed. The colonists, stunned but suspicious, fed him beer and cornbread, which frankly was a bold culinary choice, considering their track record. But Somerset stayed the night, and when he left, he promised to return, with someone who could help them survive. Spoiler, he delivered. Enter Squanto. Now, if history were a movie, Squanto would be the third-act miracle character, the unexpected ally, the how are you real figure, who changes everything. But his story isn't a miracle, it's a tragedy wrapped in irony, soaked in pain, and sprinkled with faint, reluctant hope. Squanto, real name Tisquantum, was a member of the Patuxet tribe, the same people who had lived on the very land the Pilgrims now occupied. As in, he was from the village they accidentally colonized, you know, the one they found conveniently cleared, not realizing it was cleared by plague and grief. Years earlier, Squanto had been kidnapped by an English explorer, Thomas Hunt, and sold into slavery in Spain. Yes, slavery. He eventually escaped, how exactly is unclear, and made his way to England, where he lived with a group of merchant sponsors, learned fluent English, and somehow survived long enough to join a return voyage across the Atlantic. When he finally made it back home in 1619, everyone he knew was dead. Let that land. He returns from years of captivity, clinging to the hope of reunion, and finds only silence. His people, gone. His village, hollow. The fields, overgrown. And now, in 1621, he walks back into that same land and finds it filled with pale, starving strangers building houses over the ghosts of his childhood. So what does he do? He helps them. Yes, really. He teaches them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, shows them how to tap maple trees for sap, guides them to local rivers rich with eels. An acquired taste, sure, but a source of protein nonetheless. He becomes their translator, mediator, agricultural consultant, and survival coach. He teaches them how to live on the land that once belonged to his people. It's hard to overstate how unlikely this is. Imagine your home is taken, your family wiped out, your culture desecrated, and when the new tenants show up, you not only refrain from revenge, you give them a chance to survive, not because you trust them necessarily, but because you see something worth salvaging. Squanto didn't save the Pilgrims out of some naive sense of charity. He was strategic, practical, possibly lonely, and probably saw that helping them could forge a new future for better or worse. He also helped broker one of the most important relationships in early colonial history, the alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by the Sachem Massasoit. The Wampanoag had been weakened by years of epidemic and internal strife. They too needed allies. The Pilgrims, as pitiful as they appeared, had one thing the Wampanoag could use: guns and desperation. So a treaty was made: mutual protection, mutual respect. On paper, anyway. It was a moment, brief and fragile, of balance, of cooperation between two peoples who had every reason to distrust each other. This alliance wouldn't last forever. But in that first spring, it was real, and it mattered, because without it, the colony would have failed. Spectacularly. Let's make that clear. Without Squanto, the Pilgrims would have died. Not maybe. Not barely survived. Died. Every last one of them. And this is the part of the story that doesn't get enough attention. Not in textbooks. Not in children's plays. Not in polite Thanksgiving conversation. The survival of Plymouth, the very existence of it, is directly owed to a man who had every reason to walk away, or worse, but he didn't. Instead, Squanto carried the knowledge of a lost people and handed it, piece by piece, to the newcomers who had unknowingly walked over the ashes of his life. That's not just history. That's grace. Hard, complicated, messy grace. So when you picture the founding of Plymouth, don't imagine it as a triumphant planting of a flag. Picture a man who had suffered greatly, kneeling in a field with a handful of corn seeds, explaining patiently, again, how to make the land yield food to those who had no idea what they were doing. And picture the stunned settlers, blistered, broken, barely breathing, realizing that survival had walked out of the forest, wearing a breechcloth and speaking perfect English. Let's talk about the first Thanksgiving, that iconic, heartwarming moment when Pilgrims and Native Americans allegedly set aside their differences, clasped hands in mutual gratitude, and tucked into a feast so wholesome it would one day be ruined by canned cranberry jelly. It didn't happen like that. There were no buckled hats, no long wooden table stretching across a golden field, no Norman Rockwell painting coming to life. And absolutely, unequivocally, no pie. You heard me. Zero pie. Not a single sliver of pumpkin or pecan in sight. Why? Because they didn't have flour, or sugar, or ovens. But let's rewind. It was autumn 1621. The settlers had somehow, miraculously survived. They had planted corn, with Squanto's guidance, and harvested a decent crop. Some had recovered from illness. The graves were still fresh, but for once, there were no new ones. The colony was, for the first time, not actively collapsing. This alone was worth celebrating. So Governor William Bradford and the remaining colonists decided to mark the occasion, not with a formal, annual holiday, but with what was essentially a harvest festival, a sort of we didn't die party. Think fewer casseroles, more symbolic relief. The invite list, pretty limited, but word got out. And that's where things get interesting. Massasoit, Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy, showed up, not alone, but with 90 men. Imagine hosting a modest backyard dinner and having 90 uninvited guests roll in with weapons and serious appetites. That's what happened. The Pilgrims, to their credit, didn't panic. Instead, they adjusted, probably with some light internal screaming. But Massasoit's arrival wasn't hostile. It was diplomatic. It was a show of strength and goodwill. Plus, the Wampanoag brought 5 deer as gifts. That's right. First Thanksgiving featured venison, and possibly bear, and definitely wild fowl. But whether that included actual turkey is unclear. More likely it was goose or duck. They had eels too, a delicacy apparently. Also, mussels, clams, boiled pumpkin, and cornmeal mush that probably tasted like wet cardboard, unless you were starving, which they often were. And the language barrier. Oh yes. Most of the colonists spoke only English. The Wampanoag, Algonquian dialects. Squanto and Samoset did what they could to translate, but you can imagine the awkwardness. Picture trying to bond over dried maize while miming past the eel, and hoping you're not accidentally insulting someone's grandmother. Despite this, the feast lasted 3 days. There were games, contests, and displays of mutual strength. The Wampanoag demonstrated hunting skills. The colonists probably tried not to look terrified, and somewhere in all that forced merriment was the fragile beginning of what might be described generously as diplomacy. But let's be clear, this was not a celebration of equality. This was not a utopian moment where colonizers and the colonized held hands under a setting sun. It was a highly cautious temporary detente between two groups trying to survive a land soaked in trauma and uncertainty. The Wampanoag, reeling from epidemic and pressure from rival tribes, needed allies. The Pilgrims, clinging to life by splinters and prayer, needed help. This Thanksgiving wasn't born from abundance. It was born from desperation. And the funny part, the Pilgrims didn't even call it Thanksgiving. That word, in their culture, meant a religious day of fasting and solemn prayer. No food, no music. Definitely no 3-day cookout with eels and awkward charades. What they actually had was a harvest celebration, the kind of rustic gathering medieval peasants might throw after no one starved for a month. So, where did the myth come from? Centuries later, of course, like most good propaganda. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. He was trying to create unity during a time of unimaginable division, and what better symbol of peace and cooperation than a sanitized, heartwarming meal between colonists and Native Americans? Only, it wasn't peace, and it wasn't lasting. Within a generation, the alliance with the Wampanoag collapsed. Colonists expanded, natives were pushed back, betrayed, and slaughtered. The ground where they once broke eel together would become soaked with blood. So yeah, happy Thanksgiving. Still, there's something to be said about that brief moment in 1621. Awkward, unbalanced, and fragile though it was, it happened. And, in a time when most stories end with disease and death, that fact alone feels worth holding on to. For 3 days there was no war. There was food. There was survival. And maybe, just maybe, there was the smallest flicker of shared humanity, flickering like a campfire between strangers who needed each other more than they wanted to admit. And maybe that's the real story. Not the feast, not the myth, but the reminder that sometimes, even in the bleakest circumstances, people can choose to sit down, share what little they have, and try. Even if they fail later, even if the moment doesn't last. It mattered then, and it should still matter now. Imagine believing that the more miserable you are, the more righteous you must be. Welcome to Pilgrim theology, where pain was not just expected, but actively encouraged. Joy, suspicious. Comfort, morally slippery. Dancing, a gateway to eternal damnation, obviously. To understand the Pilgrims, you have to understand this core concept. Suffering was sacred. Misery was divine. And if your socks were dry and your belly full, you were probably doing something wrong. This wasn't some fringe belief. This was the spiritual engine powering the entire Plymouth experiment. The idea that earthly hardship, blisters, frostbite, starvation, public shaming, was all part of God's grand plan to purify the soul. Think of it as salvation through masochism, with a side of boiled cornmeal. It sounds extreme, but remember, these were not casual Sunday Christians. These were separatists and hardline Puritans, who believed the Church of England was too soft, too corrupt, and horror of horrors, too tolerant of human joy. They wanted purity, discipline, a society scrubbed clean of sin, frivolity, and colour. Literally, their wardrobes were 90% grey, because even clothing had to be humble and emotionally repressive. Their worldview saw life as a test, a boot camp for the afterlife. Every hardship was a pop quiz from God, and if you were too comfortable, well, that meant he wasn't testing you anymore. Which could only mean one thing: he'd given up. So yes, blisters were spiritual merit badges. Hunger was divine character development. And if you got a fever, it wasn't bacteria, it was probably your pride being cauterized from the inside out. Let's look at some of the official policies of this theology in action. Dancing was forbidden. Not just lewd dancing, any dancing. Even the spontaneous I stubbed my toe and flailed a little variety was frowned upon. Music was allowed, but only if it involved psalms, zero harmony, and absolutely no foot tap. Instruments were suspicious, especially the devil's gateway drug, the fiddle. Celebrations? Discouraged. Birthdays? Definitely not. Too self-centered. Weddings? Only acceptable if conducted without cheer. Even the act of courting was strictly regulated. If you were courting someone, a third party was often present, and not in a romantic way. Their job was to make sure no one smiled too hard. And don't even think about Christmas. The Pilgrims didn't just skip Christmas. They outlawed it. Why? Because they saw it as a corrupt, Catholic-tinged carnival of excess. Too much singing, too much feasting, too many people enjoying themselves. One year, a few men in the colony were caught playing games on Christmas Day. They were promptly scolded and forced to return to work. Merry Puritanism. Of course, this culture of enforced austerity wasn't just about rules. It was about identity. To be a pilgrim was to suffer well, to endure with stoic piety, to look hardship in the face and say, "Yes, please, I'll have another." It was also about control. Control of the self, control of others, control of the community through an elaborate network of social expectations and public judgment. Gossip wasn't just petty, it was theological surveillance. If someone was cheerful for no reason, people noticed. If someone sang a tune that wasn't in the Psalter, eyebrows were raised. If you painted your door anything other than emotionally neutral brown, you were practically a heretic. And the punishments? Oh, they were creative. You could be fined for swearing, publicly whipped for laziness, banished for dissent. There was the ducking stool for women accused of gossip, and the stocks for just about everyone else. The most infamous punishment was the cleft stick, a small wooden clamp applied to the tongue of anyone caught spreading blasphemy or worse, sarcasm. Yes, sarcasm was a punishable offense. Let that sink in. The very tone of this video could have gotten me burned at the stake, or at the very least, assigned 3 hours of public shame on a wooden platform while strangers threw turnips at me. Now here's the paradox. Despite all this repression, many of the pilgrims were deeply sincere. Their belief in divine suffering wasn't performative, it was real. They wanted to be tested. They believed hardship made them holy, that every splinter, every hungry night, every cold wind rattling through the boards of their unfinished homes was a step closer to heaven. And there's something strangely admirable about that. Misguided? Sure. Miserable? Absolutely. But also deeply human, because beneath the rules and the rags was a raw, desperate longing to matter, to be good, to be chosen. In a world where life was short and brutal, they needed suffering to mean something. Otherwise, what was the point? Let's zoom in on one pilgrim, John Billington. Billington was not a fan of the suffering gospel. He liked to speak his mind, question authority, and let his sons play outside without supervision. Scandalous stuff. He was the colony's first troublemaker, and eventually its first execution. That's right, Billington was hanged in 1630 for murder, but long before that, he was already on the edge, a thorn in the side of holy order. To the others, his resistance wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. A challenge to the carefully maintained theology of hardship. If one man started laughing too freely, what if others followed? What if suffering lost its sacred shine? So they clung tighter, to the rules, to the pain, to the belief that blisters were proof of moral progress. It's easy to mock, but ask yourself, how often do we turn struggle into identity? How often do we romanticize hard work, glorify burnout, or treat exhaustion like a badge of honor? Maybe we're not so different. Maybe we've just swapped wool tunics for blue light and late-night emails. Let's say you've just survived a brutal sea voyage, a starvation-level winter, a few surprise funerals, and a lingering infection in your foot that you're starting to name. Naturally, you're hoping for a bit of freedom, maybe to finally relax, stretch your legs, make your own choices. Well, tough luck. Because congratulations, you now live in the Mayflower Compact universe, a thrilling spin-off series where every decision must be approved by God, your neighbor, and possibly a guy named Elder Brewster who really hates laughter. When people talk about the Pilgrims and the birth of American democracy, they're usually referring to the Mayflower Compact, a short document cobbled together in 1620 to prevent the entire colony from immediately dissolving into chaos and axe fights. The ship had landed way off course, meaning their legal right to settle was murky at best. So before anyone could pull a mutiny, they drafted an agreement. They'd form a civil body politic, pledge loyalty to the king, and follow whatever laws they collectively made for the colony's good. Sounds democratic, right? Sure, if your definition of democracy includes mandatory worship, no separation of church and state, and communal rule by a small cabal of very tired Puritans. The compact was less a declaration of freedom and more a group project in crisis management. It said, essentially, we agree not to kill each other, for now, because we are cold and have no idea what we're doing. From there, things evolved. Slowly. Badly. Plymouth's government was, from the start, deeply theocratic. God wasn't just in the details. He was in the legislation, the bylaws, and probably the cooking instructions. Every law had a moral edge, every moral rule had legal weight, and every disagreement was a potential theological emergency. William Bradford, elected governor, over and over again, like the least enthusiastic homecoming king, wielded enormous influence. Though humble on paper, he and his council were basically the Supreme Court, Congress, and Church Committee rolled into one, just with worse wigs. And the laws? Oh, the law. You could be fined for skipping church, punished for profanity, publicly shamed for not observing the Sabbath. There were laws about how to wear your hair, how many hours to work, and how to speak in public. One man was whipped for stealing food. Another was banished for haughty carriage. You could lose your land for disagreeing with a sermon too loudly. Plymouth was less a community and more a live-action morality play with surprise penalties. Let's pause on the concept of banishment. In the 1600s, being banished wasn't just go to another town. It meant exile into a cold, wooded wilderness full of wolves, bears, and deeply confused native tribes, wondering why pale people kept showing up alone and crying. And yet, people were banished regularly, for blasphemy, for sedition, for being kind of annoying. Enter Thomas Morton, a man who might as well have been sent by the devil just to stress the Pilgrims out. Morton settled a bit north of Plymouth and founded Merrymount, a rival colony where people danced, drank, and even consorted with native women without lengthy sermons afterward. He erected a literal maypole. He wrote poetry. He threw parties. In other words, he committed every imaginable Puritan crime short of wearing a red suit and calling himself Satan Claus. Bradford and his council were horrified. They labelled Morton's colony a den of debauchery and sent Miles Standish to shut it down. Standish, never one to turn down a fight, marched in, arrested Morton, and eventually shipped him back to England. The message was clear. Plymouth may be miserable, but by God, it would remain pure. Even internal dissent was dangerous. If you questioned leadership, challenged a sermon, or proposed, heaven forbid, a more inclusive interpretation of Scripture, you risked everything. There were no political parties, no voting blocs, no town hall debates, just tight control, unrelenting surveillance, and the quiet knowledge that if you rocked the boat, you'd be tossed overboard, metaphorically, and occasionally literally. Yet, bizarrely, it worked. Sort of. The rigid structure kept the colony from dissolving. There was food, eventually, roads, sort of, a court system, a basic economy, and if you stayed in line, wore the right shade of beige, and kept your theological questions to yourself, you might live long enough to regret it. But make no mistake, this wasn't democracy. It was more like godly micromanagement, the spiritual HOA from hell. Still, the myth persisted. Over time, historians and school teachers cherry-picked the self-governance part of the Mayflower Compact, held it up like a sacred relic, and conveniently forgot to mention the part where you could be fined for smiling during the wrong hymn. The irony, the very structure meant to preserve unity would eventually sow the seeds of rebellion. As new settlers arrived, less pious, more practical, the old rules chafed. People wanted more freedom, more flexibility, more fun, even. The government of Plymouth tried to adapt. It added councils, created juries, and expanded civil laws beyond just God is watching you. Act like it. But the tension never fully resolved, because the truth is, governance built on fear and blisters has a shelf life. Eventually people want something more, something warmer, something that doesn't involve public lashings for falling asleep in church, which happened more than once, by the way. Ushers carried long sticks with feathers on one end, and sharp knobs on the other, one to wake women gently, one to jab men aggressively, because equality. So next time someone brings up the Mayflower Compact with misty-eyed reverence, remember, it wasn't a declaration of liberty. It was a panic clause, a stopgap. A bunch of frozen, exhausted settlers saying let's not descend into total chaos until we've at least finished building the roof. We've covered blisters, starvation, frostbite, and theological micromanagement. But there's one pilgrim hardship historians rarely talk about. Possibly because it doesn't look as dramatic in paintings, soul-crushing, sanity-eroding boredom. Welcome to a day in Plymouth Colony, where nothing happens, and then it happens again, slightly colder. If you thought the pilgrims were constantly fending off bears, discovering corn and brokering tense diplomatic deals with Squanto over smoked eel, think again. That was maybe 0.5% of their life. The other 99.5% was pure, unfiltered monotony. No entertainment, no privacy, no caffeine, no escape. You woke up at dawn, usually because the fire went out, and you were cold enough to consider voluntary combustion. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was boiled maize, again, followed by work. Endless, grinding, repetitive work. Gathering firewood, tending weak frost-nipped crops, hauling water, repairing the same drafty hut roof that tried to murder you with snow last week. Then came the mid-morning prayer session. Because even when your spine is audibly cracking under the weight of your chores, there's always time for more psalms. After that, more work, always more work. And the fun part? It never ended. There were no weekends, no breaks, no me time. The concept of leisure was viewed with deep suspicion, a gateway to sin, sloth, and possibly spontaneous jazz hands. For the average pilgrim, mental stimulation was rarer than fresh bread. Books were few, and the ones they did have weren't exactly page-turners. Think less racy romance novel, and more dense theological treatise about how everyone you've ever loved is probably going to hell. Light reading. The Bible, of course, was central. But even that could feel like spiritual homework, if your primary goal was just to stay awake and keep your fingers from falling off. Social interaction? Monitored. You could chat quietly while working, but nothing too casual, and definitely nothing flirtatious. Flirting was a punishable offense. Even smiling too often was considered a red flag. If you were seen laughing without a visible source of injury, someone might report you. Let's not forget the communal living conditions. Entire families packed into one-room houses. No insulation, no space, no silence. Imagine sharing your only sleeping area with your spouse, your children, your in-laws, and someone named Obadiah who keeps snoring out scripture. Every conversation is overheard. Every bodily function is public domain. Every argument echoes. There is no alone time. There is only less crowded time. For women, the monotony came wrapped in domestic purgatory. Wash the same clothes again. Scrape porridge off the same wooden bowls again. Boil water, clean ashes, nurse the sick. Repeat. The entire day was a loop of physical labor and unpaid emotional triage, punctuated by prayer, crying children, and occasional outbreaks of despair. And for children, no toys, no school yet, no entertainment beyond pestering adults and getting swatted with theological disapproval. Your games were things like gathering kindling and pretending it was exciting, or staring into the fire long enough to hallucinate a talking turnip. The one major community event? Church, and not the peppy, guitar-strumming kind. This was the endurance sport version of worship, hours-long sermons delivered in monotone, in an unheated building, on wooden benches so uncomfortable they felt like pennants carved into furniture. No music beyond droning psalm singing. No celebration, just a man at a pulpit, yelling about damnation through chattering teeth. Falling asleep in church was not just frowned upon. It was corrected physically. As mentioned previously, officials literally carried sticks with feathers on one end, and sharp knobs on the other. If you were a woman who nodded off, you got the feather, a gentle wake-up. If you were a man, the knob, right between the shoulder blades. Puritan equality at its finest. You'd think mealtime would be a highlight. And it was for about 4 minutes. Dinner was usually some combination of corn mush, dried meat, or boiled root vegetables. On fancy days, maybe a bit of dried fish. No seasoning, no variety, no dessert. Every bite a grey reminder that flavour was apparently invented by the devil. After dinner, more prayers, more chores, and then bed, early, cold, and fully clothed, because taking off your undergarments was both impractical and spiritually dangerous. If you were lucky, the thatched roof wouldn't leak. If you were really lucky, no one vomited in the corner. Now, repeat that. Every day. For months. Without change. Without relief. Without anything new on the horizon. Except the faint promise of planting season, which came with its own rich bouquet of blistering labor and emotional collapse. There was no music, no alcohol, not in celebration anyway, no holidays outside the Sabbath, no art, no theatre, no storytelling unless it had a firm moral at the end warning you that you were a terrible person. The boredom wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. People began to fray at the edges. Some lost their tempers. Some wandered into the woods and didn't return. Some grew quiet. Others began to doubt. If this was the holy life, why did it feel like eternal waiting? Because that's what it was, waiting for crops, for ships, for letters, for a sign, for something, anything to change. And change did come. Eventually, but not in the way they expected. Not with trumpets or triumph, just the slow creeping arrival of new settlers, new questions, new frictions, the outside world slipping in, one muddy bootprint at a time. But until then, just another day, another song, another bowl of boiled disappointment. Ever been so bored you started quoting Leviticus for fun? They were. When we talk about pilgrims, the mental image tends to skew heavily male, tall black hats, buckled shoes, furrowed brows gazing toward destiny. But here's the thing. While William Bradford was busy writing dramatic journal entries and Miles Standish was off measuring his masculinity against local shrubbery, someone was making dinner. Someone was wrapping frostbitten feet. Someone was giving birth, burying the baby, and still remembering to scrub the porridge pot. Welcome to the brutally invisible world of the Pilgrim woman. Let's start with some context. Of the 102 Mayflower passengers, only 18 were adult women. Just let that number simmer for a second. 18. That's not even enough to form a decent book club, let alone staff an entire civilization. And within the first brutal winter, half of them were dead. Still, no one rewrote the storybook. The hats stayed, the women didn't. Take Elizabeth Hopkins, for example. She boarded the Mayflower pregnant, because obviously being wedged into a wooden coffin of a ship with 101 other passengers wasn't uncomfortable enough. She gave birth mid-voyage, during a storm, in a boat with no fresh water, no mattress, and roughly 8 million diseases per square inch. She named her son Oceanus, which is either beautifully poetic or a cry for help, possibly both. Then there was Susanna White, who also gave birth on the Mayflower, after her husband had already died. She later remarried Edward Winslow, because romance in the colony was basically a game of who's not dead yet. Love in the time of mass graves. These women didn't just survive. They fed the sick. They kept fires burning. They made crude medical poultices from herbs, bark, and the rapidly draining reservoir of their sanity. And they did it all while wearing full-length wool dresses, thick petticoats, and the emotional weight of knowing no one would paint their portraits. Work began before sunrise. Haul water, start the fire, mash corn, stir mush, soothe the child with rickets, soothe the husband with theology, repeat. Childbirth alone was a recurring dice roll, with death. There were no doctors, just other women, and maybe a midwife if you were lucky and she hadn't died that week. If something went wrong, and it often did, you screamed into a rag and hoped your husband had enough emotional depth to name the baby something less depressing than deliverance. The mortality rate for women in childbirth was astronomical. But even if you survived that little miracle, congratulations, your reward was diapers made of moss, 2 hours of sleep, and the absolute privilege of returning to your full course schedule within the week, because there was no maternity leave in Puritan theology. Pain was holy. Blisters were blessings. Exhaustion meant you were spiritually on the right path. Hooray. You want to know why they didn't write the history books? Because they were too busy saving the people who did. There are no lengthy journal entries from the women of Plymouth. No personal memoirs. No dear diary. Today I buried my second child, and still had to knead bread. Their stories survive in fragments, side notes, second-hand mentions by men who forgot to ask for their opinions. And yet, they were everywhere, teaching children, nursing the dying, sewing clothing out of literally whatever wasn't already being used as insulation. One woman, whose name was either remembered as Good Wife or simply omitted altogether, reportedly turned her entire home into a hospital during the winter of death. No pay, no recognition, just unending cold and a sense of moral obligation. It wasn't just physical labor, it was emotional labor. Holding weeping neighbors, keeping morale from collapsing entirely, offering a prayer while the men argued over land and leadership. And if any of them complained, that was pride. Sinful. Best to suffer quietly, which they did. Exceptionally well. Even religion didn't offer relief. The church saw women as subordinate, spiritually and intellectually. They couldn't preach. They couldn't vote. They could, however, be publicly punished for tempting the community with sins, such as showing their ankles or smiling too confidently. One woman, accused of immodesty, was forced to stand for hours on a public platform while being shamed by the entire town. Her crime? Laughing at the wrong moment. Not adultery, not theft, just a chuckle, out of place. A reminder, joy was suspicious. And yet, despite this constant background radiation of systemic dismissal, the women kept going. They built literal and metaphorical homes. They preserved what little culture and humanity the colony had left. They taught the children not just how to cook or clean, but how to endure, how to hope. And occasionally, rarely, their stories broke through. Mary Chilton, for instance, is rumored to be the first European woman to set foot on New England soil. She leapt from the boat before the men could climb down, a footnote in many records, but imagine that moment. The land cold, the future uncertain. Everyone terrified, and she jumps first. Not for glory, but probably because she was just tired of waiting for the men to argue about who should go first. The true miracle of Plymouth wasn't that it survived, it's that the women did. They carried trauma in their bones, blisters on their feet, and hope, unbelievably, in their hearts. Because despite everything, they believed it might get better, that their daughters might live softer lives, that one day someone might tell the story right. So, consider this a start. No buckle hats, no pie, just a few names, a few faces, and a colony that rested, quite literally, on their tired shoulders. By the spring of 1623, Plymouth was somehow still standing, or at least slumping upright under a thin veneer of optimism and splinters. The graves were full, the food was not. And the mood? Let's call it 10. Imagine trying to build a holy utopia with 37 people, half a barn and one shared spoon. Now imagine that one guy won't stop loudly questioning whether God actually cares about your blisters. Welcome to the golden age of bickering, pestilence and personality clashes. Let's be clear, the original Mayflower passengers weren't one big Puritan friend group. There were separatists, non-separatists, hired labourers, indentured servants, and at least 3 people who had no idea what they'd signed up for. They were united in misery, but divided in just about everything else. Theology, hygiene standards, and whether or not it was okay to steal from the community beanpot. At first, the thin veil of religious obligation kept everyone pretending to get along, but as food ran out and tempers ran thin, the cracks widened. Whispers started. Factions formed. The word mutiny hovered in the air, not like a declaration, but like a sneeze you can feel coming for weeks. One of the more infamous troublemakers was a man named John Billington. He was technically a stranger, not a separatist, and from the very start, he was an absolute migraine in human form. He disrespected leaders. He argued in public. He questioned the rule. In other words, he was the colony's first Twitter user. Eventually, Billington's behavior escalated from unpopular dinner guest to public safety hazard. He threatened Miles Standish, which, considering Standish's general approach to diplomacy was stab first, sermon later, was a bold choice. Over the years, John Billington managed to alienate just about everyone. His children got into trouble. His wife was cited for slander. And in 1630, he became the first English colonist executed for murder in New England. If you're wondering how bad things had to get for the very first public hanging to be seen as a community relief event, meanwhile, cabin fever was morphing into full-body paranoia. People who had once prayed together now glared across the common house. The tiny community, bound together by shared trauma and frostbite, was starting to resemble a bad reality show. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was grieving. and no one was emotionally stable. Then came the new arrivals, because apparently, what this delicate powder keg really needed was more mouths to feed. Over the next couple of years, other ships started arriving, not packed with supplies or reinforcements, mind you. Mostly just more colonists, including many who had no idea how to farm, fish, or build anything. They showed up expecting housing and food. The Plymouth residents, meanwhile, were eating bark and looking at these newcomers like they were sacrificial side dishes. One ship in particular, the Anne, which arrived in 1623, brought around 60 more settlers. They were technically reinforcements, but emotionally, they were the final Jenga block. Food rations dropped, personal space disappeared. The already brittle peace shattered. Sickness spread with grim predictability. Typhus, dysentery and good old-fashioned seasonal death made their rounds. There was no doctor, just the same woman who was midwifing babies last week, now trying to lance boils with a spoon. The lines between medicine and guesswork were thin. Here, chew this bark and pray was the closest thing to a treatment plan. And through all of this, the leadership tried to hold the line. William Bradford scribbled in his journals with increasing spiritual exhaustion. Miles Standish continued his militia cosplay, and the communal storehouse, empty, or depending on who you asked, mysteriously miscounted. People began hoarding, stealing, whispering. Little acts of rebellion bloomed in the corners. Someone refused to show up to prayer. Someone else questioned the sanctity of ration distribution. In a larger society, these would be minor offences. In Plymouth, they were seismic events. Even farming, the one thing that could have saved everyone, became a point of contention. The initial system had been collective, everyone worked the same land and shared the yield. But as it turns out, when everyone's starving and half the group is phoning it in, socialism loses popularity fast. Bradford eventually dismantled the communal model in favour of privately assigned plots. Suddenly, people worked harder. Shocking what happens when you're allowed to keep your own turnips. But it wasn't just farming and food that divided them, it was ideology. The colony's original vision, a shining example of godly community, was unravelling under the weight of real human behaviour, greed, envy, exhaustion. Some began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Plymouth wasn't the New Jerusalem, after all, just a muddy village full of traumatized people doing their best with rocks, wet shoes, and bad theology. Eventually, rules tightened. Dissenters were fined, exiled, publicly shamed. Plymouth became less of a sanctuary and more of a spiritual HOA. Aggressive oversight, mandatory meetings, and no dancing allowed. By the late 1620s, the lines had been drawn. True believers versus the increasingly skeptical. Starched collars versus rolled-up sleeves, and in the middle of it all, the ordinary settler, just trying to survive, plant enough corn, and maybe, just maybe, avoid getting caught in the crossfire of yet another theological debate. Let that sink in. They'd survived the voyage, the winter, the hunger, only to be brought low by internal rot, the kind that doesn't show up on maps or manifest as symptoms, just slow erosion, one disagreement at a time. So no, it wasn't the Wampanoag that fractured Plymouth, or even the weather. It was the humans. As usual, somewhere between the frostbite and the frostbitten theology, the real story of the Pilgrims got hijacked by a fourth-grade craft project. Paper turkeys, buckle hats, cardboard cutouts holding hands in perfect harmony, and poof, just like that, the blistered, starving, grief-stricken settlers became cheerful icons of American wholesomeness. Neat, tidy, and sanitized for your dinner table convenience. But how did this happen? How did a tale of near-total failure and communal graveyards turn into a story about cranberry sauce? Let's rewind. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the original Pilgrims were long gone. Their colony had been swallowed by larger, louder ones. And their journals, dusty relics in the back of libraries. America was now a growing, squabbling republic in need of, well, a better origin story. See, you can't build a national identity around some guys who accidentally landed in the wrong place, almost died, and mostly argued about socks. But you can build it around humble beginnings, religious liberty, and feasting. So that's exactly what happened. Washington Irving, yes, the same guy who gave us the Headless Horseman, helped stitch the first few fantasy scenes. His writings in the early 1800s painted the Pilgrims as noble, courageous founders, stiff upper-lipped heroes with pious resolve and excellent posture. Never mind the lice. Then came the 1830s and 1840s, the golden age of romanticizing colonial hardship. Monuments were erected, Pilgrim-themed literature exploded, and suddenly, William Bradford's Journal of Plymouth Plantation went from forgotten scribbles to sacred scripture, except people kind of skipped the parts where half the colony died, and John Billington got hanged for murder. That stuff doesn't pair well with stuffing. By the mid-19th century, Americans had fully committed to the myth. The Pilgrims were brave, the Native Americans were friendly. Everyone brought a casserole. This tidy tale of cooperation and resilience offered the kind of moral clarity that actual history rarely provides. Especially convenient during a time when the country was barreling towards civil war. Nothing like a feel-good founding story to paper over internal collapse. Oh, and let's not forget the marketing. By the late 1800s, Thanksgiving, previously just a regional New England tradition, got nationalized. President Abraham Lincoln declared it a federal holiday in 1863 during a civil war, because nothing says unity like pretending everything started with pie. From there, the Pilgrims were doomed to be remembered, inaccurately, forever. School textbooks cemented the narrative. Illustrators added buckle hats and turkey legs, because visual tropes are powerful, and also deeply inaccurate. Hollywood eventually joined in, and before long, the Pilgrims weren't real people anymore. They were branding, mascots for a national bedtime story. Never mind that the first Thanksgiving probably involved more venison than turkey, or that the Wampanoag weren't invited in the way we imagine. More like they showed up because 90 armed Englishmen firing muskets near their territory sounded a bit alarming. But hey, this version had table settings. Now let's talk about silence, the things we don't say when we tell this story. We don't talk about the long-term consequences. But within a generation of the first Thanksgiving, English expansion led to devastating wars with the very tribes who once helped them. We don't talk about the epidemics that wiped out 90% of the coastal native population before a single pilgrim set foot on shore. We don't mention that the land the Pilgrims found empty had been full of life, culture, and burial sites only a few years before. No, we skip those parts. Because they're messy, inconvenient. Unthanksgiving. This is not a call to cancel holidays, or to throw pumpkin pie into the sea. It's a call to wake up, gently, sleepily even, to the reality beneath the glitter, because every myth comes at a cost, and the cost of this one is clarity. The real Pilgrims were not heroes. They were not villains. They were human. Messy, stubborn, devout, and desperately hungry. They fought. They failed. They clung to beliefs that hurt as much as they helped. And they endured, not because of their hats, but in spite of everything else. There's a strange comfort in that, isn't there? That history isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. So maybe, the next time you see a smiling pilgrim figurine with pink cheeks and a cartoon cornucopia, you'll remember the actual faces, pale from illness, red from windburn, hollow-eyed from grief. Maybe you'll think about William Bradford hunched over his journal, trying to make sense of so much death, or about a woman burying her second child in 6 months, while still nursing her third, or a young man digging graves at night so no one sees how many bodies are piling up. Maybe you'll remember Squanto, abducted, enslaved, returned, still helping the strangers who now stood on the graves of his people. And maybe you'll wonder, what other myths do we cling to? What stories have we polished so hard that we've worn away the truth? History, when told honestly, isn't cozy. It's complicated, which is why we so often reach for the comfortable version instead. But here's the secret. The truth still matters, especially when it makes us squirm. Let's go for a walk. Not through the fantasy forest of elementary school dioramas, but across the uneven dirt paths of Plymouth, Massachusetts, the real one. Step lightly. You're walking on graves. No signs, no fences, no carefully mowed rectangles, just ground, grass, dirt, maybe a few jagged stones weathered past legibility. Beneath your feet, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of unnamed pilgrims. Children, mothers, men who froze to death one ration away from survival, women who died from childbirth, or grief, or both. This was not the America of manifest destiny. It was barely a survival zone. And yet, they came. Why? The deeper we go into this story, the more unanswerable that question becomes. Because make no mistake, what the Pilgrims did was ridiculous. Boarding a creaky wooden ship for an unknown world across a dangerous sea, with no GPS, no antibiotics, and a vague hope that somewhere out there was a place where no one would make you kneel the wrong way during prayer. Hope, it turns out, is often indistinguishable from delusion, at least until it works. We romanticize it now. We call it faith, or courage, or the pioneer spirit. But for the people living it, it felt more like frostbite and failure, like watching your children starve while you whisper hymns under your breath, trying to convince yourself God still cares. It felt like peeling open your shoes in the morning to check which of your toes had given up during the night. And still, they hoped. William Bradford once wrote that all great and honourable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, which sounds noble, until you realise he wrote that while burying half his friends. Let that sink in. Hope isn't always noble. Sometimes it's desperate. Sometimes it's irrational. Sometimes it's the only thing left standing when your body is broken, your friends are gone, and your faith is just a collection of words you keep repeating because the alternative is silence. We've spent a lot of chapters laughing at the absurdity of it all, the blisters, the bad theology, the wet bread. But here's the twist ending no one expects in a sarcastic history documentary. The Pilgrims were deeply, painfully human. They were wrong about a lot, but they weren't pretending to suffer. They didn't fake the agony, and they didn't quit. They buried their dead, and kept building. Not because they were saints, but because they were stubborn. And stubbornness, mixed with just enough faith, can look a lot like heroism in hindsight. Now imagine this. It's midnight. You're a mother. You've just buried your third child. Your hands are raw from digging. The wind cuts through the gaps in your wooden wall like a knife. You don't sleep. You pray. You stare into the darkness and wonder if maybe this whole new world thing was a mistake. But then, morning comes, and you get up. You start a fire. You cook for the sick. You sing badly because you're tired. And you wash the feet of a neighbor who can no longer stand. No one records your name. But you lived. You helped others live. That's history too. It's not the part they paint in murals or reenact in parades, but it's the part that matters. We tend to measure history by winners, founders, survivors, famous last words, carved into monuments. But what if we looked instead at the costs? What if we counted the blisters? Because the truth is, most of history was lived by people who never got statues. They got splinters. They got grief. They got a slightly warmer fire on the fourth attempt. They didn't change the world, they just kept it going. And that's enough. We're told the Pilgrims came seeking freedom. Maybe. But more accurately, they came seeking a place where their version of control would be uncontested. A theocracy by candlelight. Was it noble? Sometimes. Was it brutal? Often. But more than anything, it was human. In all its confused, hopeful, shivering mess. There's a quiet tragedy in realizing how many of their dreams died with them. The vision of a perfect colony, compromised. The promise of prosperity, delayed. The desire for religious purity. Spoiler, it didn't age well. By the time the second generation grew up, they were already arguing about land, taxes, and how much dancing was too much dancing. Answer, still any. So why tell this story? Why peel back the myth, only to stare down at unmarked graves? Because within all that discomfort, that blunt, blistered truth, there's something sacred. Something honest. A reminder that history is not just a celebration of achievement, it's a reckoning with the price of dreams. We can learn from the Pilgrims, not because they were right, but because they were real. They failed in interesting ways. They suffered in familiar patterns, and in their stubborn hope, we see echoes of ourselves. We keep chasing things, ideals, promises, second chances, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And sometimes, we build futures that others forget were paid for in blood, and cold, and silence. So yeah, walk a little slower next time you pass a statue. Think about the names left off the plaque. The feet that blistered, the hands that carried water, the backs that broke before the story got good. Because even if we don't remember their faces, we're standing on their footprints. You'd think there'd be a payoff. After the frostbite, starvation, diarrhea, baptisms, and emotionally repressed prayer circles, surely the Pilgrims get some kind of reward, right? A thriving colony? A democratic utopia? Maybe a single warm shoe? Nope. What they got was paperwork, property disputes, and an endless parade of new settlers who thought freedom meant steal someone else's farm. Welcome to Plymouth, where your reward for surviving your first winter is jury duty. Let's rewind for a second. In those first years, the colony stumbled along like a colonial toddler, constantly falling over, crying a lot, and unsure what to do with its own waste. The survivors of the Mayflower generation, the ones who hadn't died from exposure, illness, or biblical overcommitment, kept things going with sheer willpower and surprisingly detailed meeting notes. They held council meetings. They planted corn. They repressed emotions. But slowly, so slowly, their perfect little theocracy started to unravel. And not with a bang, but with a tedious sigh. One major problem: new people. Pilgrims had barely put up their makeshift walls when other boats started arriving. Boats with names like Fortune, Anne, and Trouble with Capitalism. Okay, maybe not the last one, but you get the idea. These newcomers didn't share the Pilgrims' vision of a spiritually pure, self-flagellating town of modesty and mud. They just wanted land, and preferably a house that didn't come with a built-in rat population. Cue the tension. Imagine you nearly died building a cabin with your last frostbitten finger, only to have Chad from England stroll in, uninvited, and say, "I'll take the one by the stream." That was the vibe. Suddenly, the colony wasn't a tight-knit community of religious zealots. It was a squabbling HOA of unequal beliefs, property lines, and terrible dental hygiene. And with more people came more problems. Disease, food shortages, lawsuits. Yes, colonial lawsuits. Over cows, fences, and whether your neighbor's child stole your goat or just borrowed it long enough to accidentally eat it. Even religion, the unshakable glue of early Plymouth, began to wobble. Some settlers wanted more freedom. Others thought the sermons were too short. A few radical visionaries asked why God always seemed to look suspiciously like their local governor. Revolutionary, truly. As tensions grew, Plymouth started to look less like a city upon a hill, and more like a poorly managed summer camp, with a growing rat problem. William Bradford, who had spent years journaling every sneeze and theological musing, began sounding less inspired and more like a spiritual office manager, dealing with divine burnout. You can almost hear the eye rolls between the lines. Still, they kept trying. The community set up trade, stumbled into a half-working economy, and managed to keep themselves only partially starving. There were good days, harvests that didn't fail, births that didn't end in tragedy, songs sung around fires when no one had the energy to argue about doctrine. But something had shifted. Hope had hardened into habit, and the once radical mission became, administration. By the 1690s, several decades after the Mayflower first limped into harbour, Plymouth Colony was less a beacon of divine providence, and more a sleepy town, struggling to stay relevant. Its population stagnated, its leadership aged, its influence waned. No revolutions, no grand cathedrals, just more fields to till, more fences to fix, and more funerals to attend. Eventually, Massachusetts Bay Colony, the bigger, flashier, slightly more fashionable Puritan neighbor to the north, absorbed Plymouth. It was less of a hostile takeover and more of a slow merging, like two tired pilgrims agreeing to share a blanket. The ideals that founded Plymouth, dismantled, rebranded, or forgotten. The people, assimilated. Their legacy turned into storybooks, statues, and very awkward parades. Think of it like a startup that never scaled. The investors died of scurvy, the board meetings were held in a barn, and by the end the founders were just glad someone else was paying for the candles. But here's the punch in the gut. It kind of had to happen that way, because ideals don't last forever. People do. Sort of. The children of pilgrims didn't want to wear all black and argue about baptism. They wanted warm houses, decent food, and the freedom to be just slightly less miserable. And in pursuit of that comfort, the original vision got sanded down, smoothed out, sanitized, until all that remained were a few mottos and a deeply ironic holiday. We love to remember Plymouth as a beginning, the spark that lit the American story. But maybe it was more of a cautionary tale, that even the most stubborn dreamers can be undone, not by failure but by time, that the real enemy of conviction isn't persecution, it's paperwork. Still, if there's something oddly noble about this collapse, it's that the Pilgrims didn't go out with a bang. They didn't become villains. They just faded. Slowly, humanly, kind of beautiful, in a tragic, footsore way. So the next time someone brings up Pilgrim values, maybe ask, which part? The part where they fled oppression, or the part where they built fences and held grudge matches over pig ownership? History, like people, doesn't tie itself up neatly. It rambles, it bleeds, it sometimes ends in a quiet sigh, not a victory lap. And for the Pilgrims? They walked through hell, built a colony, and got absorbed into something bigger, like so many others who came after. It's late now. The fire has burned low. You've heard every footstep, every frostbitten scream, every theologically mandated frown, and still you're here, curled up with history's itchiest blanket, the story of the Pilgrims. So, what do we do with it? What do we do with the pus-filled socks, the mouldy corn, the optimism so intense it bordered on self-harm? We remember, and maybe, just maybe, we learn. Let's begin with the feet. Yes, again, those blistered, cracked, misaligned feet. They're a perfect metaphor, really. The Pilgrims marched forward no matter how bad the terrain was, convinced that pain was just part of the process. And in a twisted, Puritan way, they were right. It was. Pain built Plymouth. Pain buried its dead. Pain turned a leaky boat ride into a sacred origin myth. But here's the thing. They weren't gods, or saints, or even particularly good planners. They were human, woefully so. And if there's anything comforting about that, it's the reminder that human doesn't mean perfect. It means messy. It means contradictory. It means you can be both deeply faithful and catastrophically wrong about how corn works. They left England in search of religious freedom and promptly outlawed joy. They risked everything for a better life and made sure it came with mandatory church attendance. They fled persecution and built fences. It's easy to mock them, and we should. But after the laughter settles, what's left is something quieter. A kind of stubborn courage, the kind that gets up each morning, bleeding from the soles, and says one more row of turnips, one more hymn, one more chance. Why? Because they believed it mattered. Because even if they were wrong about almost everything, the medicine, the geography, the fashion, they were right about this. The future is worth building, even when you have no idea what it'll look like. So yeah, they didn't build utopia. Plymouth wasn't the shining city on a hill. It was a mud-splattered, wind-chilled, half-starved experiment in just not giving up. And in a world constantly pushing for perfection, maybe that's the lesson we actually need. Now, let's talk legacy. The modern version of the Pilgrims. It's cleaner, brighter, less gangrene. We get smiling statues, cartoon turkeys, and crafts made of felt. But that's not the story. That's the bedtime version. The real tale is rough, inconvenient, beautifully unmarketable. It's about people who chose suffering, not for fame, not for power, but because they were chasing something they couldn't name. A whisper, a promise, a hope. That should sound familiar, because we do the same thing. Not in buckle hats or wool cloaks, sure, but every time we take a risk, leave something behind, or decide that comfortable isn't enough, we're walking our own crooked path through the November frost. No one talks about that part at Thanksgiving. Instead, we talk about feasts that didn't happen, and harmony that didn't last. We skip the graves, we polish the myths, and while it's tempting to rewrite history to make it more palatable, maybe it's better, healthier, to let the hard parts breathe, to sit with the blisters, to sleep with the questions, to accept that not all sacrifices result in success, but they still matter. So next time you're at a family gathering, eyeing the canned cranberry sauce and avoiding political debates, spare a thought for the actual Pilgrims, not the ones from greeting cards, but the real, awkward, possibly lice-ridden people who bet everything on an idea they could barely define, and lost a lot, but not everything. Because somewhere between the soil and the sermons, they gave us something weirdly enduring, the story of how messy beginnings are still beginnings, of how survival can be sacred, of how even failed dreams leave footprints. And yes, most of those footprints were limping, but they were moving forward. That matters. So, what's the takeaway? Is it that we should glorify pain? Absolutely not. Is it that we should start our own colonies and argue about trousers? Please, no. The real lesson is gentler. It's this. We are all in some form pilgrims, seeking something, struggling through, occasionally overconfident about our cartography skills. And that's okay. The pilgrims didn't win, but they tried. And the trying, flawed, desperate, determined, is kind of beautiful, even if it comes with blisters. So yeah, next time your socks are damp and your day is rough, just remember, at least you're not building a colony on top of a plague burial ground. Probably. Thanks for limping through history with me. If your feet are intact and your curiosity even mildly piqued, hit subscribe, because we've got more uncomfortable truths and ironic bedtime tales waiting. Rest well, and remember, it's always better to study history than live it.